The heir to the British throne did not die of pneumonia. He died surrounded by a silence too perfect to be accidental, a silence prepared long before his last breath. To the public, he was a beloved prince, the gentle future of empire. To those behind palace doors, he was a liability waiting to erupt. Those two versions of one man could not live together forever. One had to be erased. For more than a century, the record has never changed. A sudden illness, a nation's mourning, the tragic loss of youth and promise. But the traces that should explain his final days have dissolved. Letters burned, diaries sealed, witnesses dismissed. The remaining narrative was polished until it shone clean, dignified, empty of friction. What stayed hidden were the fractures beneath the gold leaf. 3 truths lie buried beneath that official story. The first, a scandal so deep it threatened the survival of the monarchy itself. The second, evidence that vanished within days of his death. And the third, a pattern that still determines which royal lives may be remembered honestly and which must end quietly. By the time this story ends, you will understand why Prince Albert Victor's death was not a tragedy, it was a warning. If stories like this fade into comfort, history becomes marketing. Don't look away. Silence is how truth disappears. January 1892. Sandringham House in Norfolk lay under a heavy frost. The estate stood quiet except for the sound of church bells from nearby villages and the low wind sweeping across the fields. Inside, the heir to the British Empire celebrated his 28th birthday. The following morning, he complained of chills. In a few days, he was dead. The announcement moved with mechanical precision. The royal physicians had done their part. Newspapers received their brief. Inflammation of the lungs, they wrote. Deep national sorrow. God's mysterious will. Across the empire, bells tolled and curtains were drawn. Flags dropped to half-mast on government buildings from London to Calcutta. For a quarter of the world, mourning became law. But behind the gates of Sandringham, there were no tears, only relief too dangerous to admit aloud, because this death, quiet and convenient, had solved a problem that had haunted the palace for years. The problem wore the face of the dead man himself. 2 years before, long before the official diagnosis of pneumonia, editors in New York had already predicted that this heir would never be permitted to rule. The least suitable successor imaginable, wrote the Times. He will not ascend the throne, echoed others. The phrasing was cautious, but the implication wasn't. They had seen enough of how monarchies protect themselves to recognize the rhythm. When a royal threatens the system, history calls what follows an accident. To foreign journalists, the prince's doom felt inevitable. To Victorians, it was unspoken but understood. They knew how dangerous certain rumours could be, especially those that reached beyond gossip and touched morality. What made this young man such a threat that even his own family began to fear him? Albert Victor Christian Edward, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, Eddie, to those who loved him, was born too early and too fragile in the winter of 1864. His mother, Princess Alexandra, had fallen on the ice while pregnant. Some said the shock hastened the birth. The child that arrived was pale, restless, and weak. From his first days, there was talk of delay words that would follow him all his life. Slow to learn, easily distracted, gentle but absent. Tutors reported their findings with the tact expected in royal service. Behind every careful phrase was a diagnosis the Victorians could not speak. Limited comprehension, abnormally dormant, indifferent to study. His younger brother George quickly outpaced him in everything: reading, languages, navigation, discipline. They were raised together so that Eddie might learn by imitation, but imitation only revealed the gap more clearly. At court, it was noticed, then whispered, then accepted as fact. The elder son was dull. The wrong brother had been born first. The monarchy could tolerate eccentricity. It could not tolerate incompetence. A sovereign must represent divine order. Weakness in the heir meant weakness in the system. The royal household adapted as it always did, quietly, strategically. They assigned new tutors. They revised expectations. They reduced his public appearances. But the problem persisted. Every tutor, every aide, every companion wrote the same thing in different words. This young man was made for kindness, not command. And when intellect failed him, he sought meaning elsewhere. He began to crave affection, not ceremony, but attention. In the strict environment of the late Victorian court, that need was dangerous. It made him susceptible to the kind of companionship that polite society condemned and tabloids would have devoured if they dared. By his 20s, the contrast between the brothers had become a public joke. George, disciplined, grave, a sailor's son of empire. Eddie, charming, easily led, a man of delicate inclinations. The difference was visible in photographs. One looks like a commander, the other a dreamer. The palace could not change what people saw, but it could control what they heard and what they never would. London, 1889. The empire was still trembling from the horror of the Whitechapel murders when another story began to stir, one that struck closer to the heart of the establishment. It began, as scandals often do, with something ordinary. A stolen coin. A 15-year-old telegraph boy named Charles Swinscoe was caught and questioned. The money he had, he said, came from work not at the telegraph office, but at a house in Cleveland Street. He described a clientele of titled men, officers, and gentlemen. The house was a brothel, the clientele, aristocrats. And the man who ran it, Charles Hammond, had friends in high places. The police followed the trail with caution. The higher it climbed, the slower the investigation moved. The names that appeared were not of criminals, but of courtiers. Among them, Lord Arthur Somerset, equerry to the Prince of Wales and friend of Prince Albert Victor. Within weeks, the inquiry had reached a level where evidence became embarrassment. Then everything froze. Witnesses fled abroad, Hammond disappeared, files were transferred between departments until none could be found. The newspapers hinted, but never named. A noble lord, a distinguished figure, a personage whose name we cannot print. In the British press, silence was patriotic duty, but abroad, editors had fewer masters. The name Albert Victor appeared in columns across the Atlantic, across Europe, across the empire's far edges. And just as the rumours peaked, the prince's itinerary changed. A tour of India was suddenly brought forward. Officially, it was a gesture of imperial goodwill. Privately, it was understood as exile. When scandal reaches the level of succession, the cure is distance. In the polite vocabulary of empire, banishment is called service. The Cleveland Street scandal faded from headlines by the time his ship reached Bombay, but the stain it left was indelible. The boy prostitutes served their sentences. The aristocrats went untried. The police received their promotions, the press returned to loyalty, and the heir presumptive, far from home, learned how effectively a reputation could be cleaned or erased. Yet scandal has memory. It does not vanish, it mutates. When Eddie returned to England 2 years later, his public smile looked steadier, his manners more polished, but his eyes in photographs carried the weariness of someone already translated into myth. The whispers trailed him still, not just of Cleveland Street, but of his friendships, his indulgences, his mind. To his family, he was no longer simply disappointing, he was dangerous. Efforts were made to domesticate him. The court began arranging introductions with eligible princesses, respectable daughters of noble houses. He met Princess Mary of Teck, a quiet, serious young woman from a family near enough to the crown to matter, but distant enough to be safe. The engagement was planned, delayed, confirmed, delayed again. Each time, something new emerged to darken the headlines abroad. A rumor, an affair, a sickness. And each time, the palace pressed harder to protect the image of stability. But truth has a way of seeping through sealed walls. While the engagement was being prepared, Other stories reached the court whispers of a woman, a wife of an engineer, claiming that the prince had fathered her child. Her name was Marjorie Hatton. She was dismissed as unstable, her claims absurd. Yet she was quietly sent away, and records later surfaced suggesting payments made on her behalf. The files, marked confidential, hinted at a larger fear, not scandal itself, but proof of inheritance. If her child existed, he would carry royal blood and royal complication. The pattern repeated. A chorus girl named Lydia Manton, said to have been in his company, died after ingesting carbolic acid. Her death was ruled self-inflicted. The inquest was private, its depositions sealed. A third woman, Maud Richardson, accepted money through solicitors. Decades later, her name would resurface in auctioned letters written in the prince's own hand, references to a payment made for her comfort. Each incident by itself could be explained away. Together, they formed an unspoken script: intimacy, exposure, removal, settlement, silence. Money first, silence second. The palace learned quickly that truth was negotiable currency. What mattered was not innocence, but containment. And so, each scandal was folded into secrecy, one after another, until the heir's reputation became an empty shell, a man constructed entirely out of what could not be said. For those who watched closely, the transformation was unmistakable. He had gone from slow student to liability, from liability to burden. The family no longer asked whether he could rule. They wondered how long the monarchy could survive if he did. He was 28, handsome still, but hollowed by exhaustion. Behind the charm and the ceremonial uniform was a man running out of places to hide. His tutors had failed him, his family had used him, his lovers had been silenced, and the empire he was meant to rule had already moved on. It is tempting to believe that history turns on grand battles and bold decisions, but sometimes it turns on a quiet choice, the decision to remove one life to preserve an idea. By the winter of 1892, the idea of Albert Victor had become intolerable. A crown built on divine order could not survive a flawed successor. A monarchy built on illusion could not risk an heir who reminded the world it was human. And so, when the fever came, it was treated with calm. The doctors prescribed rest, warmth, the usual tonics. They recorded the symptoms, but not the cause. By the time his breath slowed, the relief in the corridors was palpable. The official word was pneumonia. The unofficial word was deliverance. He died at Sandringham at 9:15 in the morning. The telegram reached Osborne House an hour later. The Queen ordered mourning to begin immediately. The great bell of St. Paul's announced it to London, and the city bowed its head in grief it had been taught to feel. But in quiet rooms, behind drawn curtains, another kind of prayer was whispered, not for his soul, but for the crown he had almost ruined. And that is where the nightmare truly begins. Death, when it comes to royalty, is never only an ending. It is a rehearsal, a performance, a restoration of order. The body is still warm, yet already the narrative is being embalmed. And the story of Prince Albert Victor was rewritten before the first wreath was laid. Officially, he died of pneumonia. Unofficially, his death was the final act of a long containment, one that began years before the illness and ended only when his name could be spoken again without fear. In the months that followed, courtiers spoke softly of fate, but beneath the layers of condolence and ceremony there was calculation. The crown had survived a near disaster, and the machinery that ensured that survival would be refined for generations to come. To understand what that machinery erased, we have to return to the scandal that had made his removal, whether natural or convenient, seem almost merciful. London, 1889, a city pretending to be moral while living by indulgence. Beneath its sermons and fog lay an underworld of servants, courtiers, and errand boys who understood that wealth and virtue were rarely found in the same drawing room. When the Cleveland Street affair broke, it exposed that contradiction with surgical precision. The arrest of a single telegraph boy opened a door onto a house that catered to men of privilege, men who had every reason to believe the law existed to protect, not prosecute, them. Inspector Aberline, still famous for his work on the Ripper cases, began the investigation. What he found was not a network of criminals, but of patrons, officers, lords, and equerries. It was a scandal that climbed so high it brushed the hem of the throne itself. Lord Arthur Somerset, equerry to the Prince of Wales, appeared repeatedly in witness statements. He was questioned, released, then quietly sent abroad. The brothel keeper, Charles Hammond, fled with passage mysteriously funded. The files went missing, and when the trail seemed poised to reach one more step upward to the Prince of Wales's son, it stopped dead. In the United States, editors wrote what British ones could not. The heir presumptive, they said, has been hurried abroad until the storm subsides. Some claimed he would never return alive. The British government said nothing. Silence was policy, and the silence worked. Within weeks, Albert Victor was dispatched to India. Officially, it was an educational tour. Unofficially, it was exile with a timetable. On the journey, he posed for photographs, smiled for newspapers, shook hands with soldiers. He was the perfect emblem of empire, unquestioning, decorative, safe. But in private letters, he complained of exhaustion and fevers. The doctors who accompanied him noted symptoms too vague to name. Mercury was prescribed, rest was advised. To a modern ear, the treatment sounds familiar for one reason only. It was standard for venereal disease. When he returned to Britain, the rumours had cooled, but they had not disappeared. They never do. Whisper became knowledge, knowledge became certainty, and certainty, when it cannot be spoken, becomes poison. The court tried again to rehabilitate him. Engagements were arranged. His name was linked with Princess Mary of Teck. The announcement was meant to end speculation once and for all. But fate, or habit, or carelessness intervened. Marjorie Haddon claimed she had given birth to his child. The palace branded her a fantasist, yet she was quietly sent away, supported by a stipend whose origin no one could trace. Years later, her son would claim to be the offspring of the Duke of Clarence. Whether true or not, his belief alone was dangerous. Then there was Lydia Manton, the chorus girl found dead after drinking carbolic acid. The coroner called it despair. Her friends called it silence enforced. Her story ended behind closed doors. The records were sealed. A third name, Maud Richardson, followed the same pattern. A relationship hinted, a payment made, a disappearance achieved. The pattern was no longer rumour, it was policy. Each indiscretion was not denied but absorbed, handled and erased. The monarchy had perfected its method. Contain, compensate, forget. But secrecy has its cost. The more it is practiced, the more it becomes habit, and habit becomes the institution itself. By the early 1892, secrecy was the Crown's immune system. Doctors were its first line of defense. They reported not to the public, but to the palace. Diagnoses became euphemisms: nervous exhaustion, fever, constitutional weakness. Letters between physicians and courtiers vanished after the prince's death. But a few fragments survive enough to suggest that the illness was neither sudden nor simple. Some contemporaries later claimed that Sir William Gull, the Queen's own physician, spoke of a young royal patient whose infection had reached the brain. His notes are lost, but his daughter confirmed that he had treated someone of extraordinary rank for a condition that could not be cured. Syphilis, in that era, was more than a disease, it was a moral verdict. To admit that an heir carried it was to admit corruption of bloodline, decay of divine right. A dynasty that claimed purity could not coexist with that stain. The infection was not just fatal, it was hereditary, and to Victorians, heredity was destiny. So the diagnosis, if that is what it was, became a secret, shared only among those who understood what it meant. The court could endure a dull heir, it could not survive a diseased one. That winter, when Albert Victor fell ill, the doctors who attended him did what doctors of the powerful have always done. They served two masters. The first, their patient; the second, the institution that paid them. And when those two loyalties collided, one always prevailed. He developed pneumonia, the official story says. But pneumonia is often what people die of when their bodies have already been weakened by something else. He lay at Sandringham surrounded by his mother, his father, and a team of physicians who had seen this trajectory before. His pulse weakened, his breathing slowed. The reports written later described their helplessness, their grief, their surprise. Yet none of them ever produced the notes that should exist from those days. There was no autopsy. There was no inquest. Only a proclamation issued with precision that told the nation what to think. It worked. The empire mourned exactly as instructed. Bells tolled, prayers were said, and the myth of the saintly prince began to form even before his coffin was closed. Behind the ritual, however, the courtiers breathed easier. The danger had passed. The monarchy had purified itself. If you have ever wondered why old institutions survive while others fall, it is because they learn this lesson early. Preservation comes before truth. The machinery that protected the House of Windsor in the 20th century was forged in that moment at Sandringham. It learned how to use sympathy as armor, ceremony as disinfectant, grief as public relations. To understand how effective that transformation was, consider what happened next. Every piece of evidence that might contradict the official story vanished within months. Sir William Gull's diary went missing after his death. Depositions from the inquest into Lydia Manton's suicide were sealed indefinitely. Letters between royal physicians and the palace disappeared. Even private correspondence mentioning the prince's health shows pages carefully cut away. When every trace of a question disappears, you do not need an answer. The absence itself becomes explanation. It is not proof of murder, it is proof of management. The goal was never vengeance, it was containment. The story that emerged served everyone. The Queen grieved a grandson taken in youth. The press celebrated a life of promise unfulfilled. The people mourned innocence, and the monarchy, cleansed of embarrassment, presented itself reborn. No one could speak of the Cleveland Street affair again. The files were forgotten, the witnesses scattered. Albert Victor became a symbol of fragility rather than failure. Poor Eddie, they called him, the gentlest lie of all. But history leaves fingerprints even on what it tries to erase. American newspapers noted the speed of embalming. French correspondents wondered aloud why the body was not shown. Private diaries of courtiers mention great relief. And within the government, memoranda discuss the necessity of preserving confidence in the succession. One line from a memo found decades later reads, "The difficulty is resolved." To the outside world, it looked like a family tragedy. To those who understood the stakes, it was the removal of a flaw in the machine. The monarchy continued, as though nothing had happened. Princess Mary married the younger brother George. The line of succession closed neatly again. The empire moved on, and yet the lesson endured. When George V died 40 years later, his physician recorded in a private journal that he had hastened the king's death with an injection so that the announcement could reach the morning papers. "The end was achieved," he wrote, "for the dignity of the crown." Dignity for whom? The dying man or the institution that could not afford to appear mortal? The pattern was set. Illness followed by silence, death followed by order, scandal followed by amnesia. Albert Victor's story was not erased, it was sanitized, repurposed, transformed into a parable of fragility. The monarchy had found its method, and it would never forget it. If you have followed this far, you already know why stories like his matter. They remind us that forgetting is not accidental, it is strategy. If the truth behind such deaths fades again, the official record will be all that remains. The record will say, he was gentle, beloved, and gone too soon. It will not say that his greatest sin was to be human in a system that demands divinity. That system still exists. Its language has changed: privacy, dignity, respect, but the instinct is the same: protect the image at any cost. So when you hear that a royal died peacefully after a short illness, remember the first time you read those words. Remember the winter of 1892 and the silence that followed. The heir to the British throne did not simply die of pneumonia. He died because, in the end, the crown could not survive him. And the machine that learned to hide his story has never stopped running. If you want that silence to keep winning, do nothing. But if you believe history should belong to the living, not the powerful, then keep listening, because the next chapter of this story is not about death. It's about the world that grew from it, the world we still live in today. When the bells finally stopped ringing and the flags returned to full mast, a strange calm settled over Britain. The empire exhaled not in grief, but in relief. The succession was safe again. The scandal that had loomed like a thundercloud above the palace had dissolved into morning silk and candlelight. Prince Albert Victor's name became a memorial, not a memory. The truth of who he had been was locked away with the files, the sealed diaries, and the unspoken agreements between ministers and monarchs. His death was not treated as loss. It was treated as correction. History records the event neatly. Pneumonia at Sandringham, January 1892. Yet, when you look closely, you begin to see how the correction spread, how the system that erased him learned to thrive on the art of disappearance. The first to vanish were the witnesses, servants dismissed, physicians sworn to discretion. The women whose names had been whispered in gossip columns were either dead, deported, or quietly relocated. The telegraph boys from the Cleveland Street case melted back into anonymity or prison. A handful of officers implicated in the affair retired on pensions. Lord Arthur Somerset, whose name had nearly dragged the scandal into daylight, lived comfortably abroad until his quiet death in 1926. The house in Cleveland Street was demolished. No plaque, no trace, no memory. London buried its sins under bricks, and the empire kept its conscience spotless. The pattern of convenience became policy. When a royal life became unmanageable, the solution was not confession, it was choreography. The monarchy learned how to turn scandal into sentiment, disgrace into myth. Deaths were softened, illnesses rebranded, rumours politely misremembered. It was not cruelty, it was survival. After Albert Victor's death, the lesson was clear to every future heir. Never let your flaws become visible. Do not give the public something to pity or to judge. The crown cannot carry the weight of empathy, it can only carry perfection. Princess Mary of Teck, once Albert Victor's fiancée, married his younger brother George the following year. It was a substitution so seamless that the public scarcely noticed. The line of succession was restored, the dynasty was safe. The system had consumed its flaw and remade itself whole again. People called it providence, but behind the language of destiny was a calculation so precise it could almost be mistaken for mercy. Even the Queen herself seemed relieved. Letters from her private secretary hint at an unspoken gratitude that peace has been preserved. In other words, the problem was gone. The nation wept on command. The church preached the familiar sermon, "The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away." The newspapers printed hymns of virtue, of innocence, of a young life lost too soon. No one asked why the funeral was arranged so quickly. No one asked why no autopsy had been performed. No one asked why the diaries of Sir William Gull and the palace physicians had disappeared. Questions are dangerous when they lead toward truth, and truth, in an empire built on divinity, is heresy. Years passed, the story hardened into marble. Poor Eddie, people said, a gentle boy, unfit for the burden of destiny. A tragic soul, mourned and forgotten. That single phrase, poor Eddie, was the perfect act of erasure. It reduced him from a man to a cautionary tale, from scandal to sentiment. But history has its ways of breathing through the cracks. Letters surface, diaries reappear, foreign reports, long ignored, begin to sound prophetic. In 1902, an American journalist uncovered correspondence suggesting that files from the Cleveland Street affair had been quietly destroyed under direct order from senior officials. The story made little impact. Britain did not want the past disturbed. The dead were to remain dead, especially the royal kind. And so, the silence continued. For the monarchy, Albert Victor's death became a template, a demonstration of how control could be reasserted through narrative. When George V eventually died in 1936, his physician, Lord Dawson, wrote in his diary that he had hastened the king's death with an injection of morphine and cocaine, not out of cruelty, but so the announcement could reach the morning papers with the proper dignity. "The end was achieved," Dawson wrote, "for the good of the nation." It was the same instinct that had governed Sandringham 40 years earlier, dignity before truth, the same choreography, repeated under another name. Every time a royal death is reported today with that same familiar phrasing, peacefully, after a short illness, you are hearing the echo of that old machinery, the same reflex polished by a century of practice. Albert Victor's nightmare did not die with him. It became policy. And perhaps that is the most chilling legacy of all, that the lesson drawn from his tragedy was not compassion, but efficiency. He was erased, and the system that erased him survived so well that it turned his silence into a strength. To this day, the archives remain incomplete. Entire folders from the 1,889 police inquiry are missing. Letters from the Prince of Wales to his physician contain abrupt gaps where Albert Victor's name should appear. The diary of the court's senior doctor, said to include his final notes, was destroyed by his heirs. These absences do not prove conspiracy, they prove discipline. The discipline of power, which knows that what is missing cannot be accused. What happened at Sandringham was more than death, it was purification. The monarchy had learned how to cleanse itself without confession. The ritual was as elegant as it was effective. But in that elegance lies horror, the quiet horror of a system that perfects erasure until it no longer recognizes it as cruelty. And while his story may belong to the 19th century, the instinct that buried him still governs today. Think about how modern institutions behave when faced with scandal. They issue statements, hold ceremonies, polish reputations, bury files. The technology changes, the pattern does not. Every monarchy, every church, every government that survives centuries learns the same trick. To control the story is to control reality. Albert Victor was the rehearsal. The 20th century was the performance. In his story, you can see the birth of modern public relations, the crafting of image as protection, the management of truth as policy. His death marked the point when monarchy shifted from divine right to strategic myth. The Victorians wanted kings to be perfect. The modern world wants them to be marketable. Both require concealment. Both fear the humanity beneath the crown. And so his name remains a whisper, neither saint nor sinner, just absence. He became a mirror for the fears of empire. Madness, morality, inheritance, decline. Each generation reinterpreted him according to its anxieties. Some called him a tragic innocent, others painted him as a secret libertine. Neither portrait is real. Both serve the same function, to obscure the man behind the myth. We cannot know who he truly was. The archive does not allow it. What survives is the institution's version, refined through decades of repetition. Yet even repetition cannot kill doubt. Doubt lingers, and doubt is history's heartbeat. Ask yourself, how many times have we seen this pattern since? How many figures have been quietly rewritten to preserve something larger than themselves? How many truths have been replaced with palatable fictions because the truth was inconvenient? The names change, the mechanisms remain. Power does not need to lie, it only needs to omit. Albert Victor's death was the perfect omission, one so absolute it became tradition. And that tradition is not past tense. It lives in every obituary written before the body cools. It lives in every press release that asks for privacy during this difficult time. It lives in every institution that believes reputation is worth more than reality. When you hear that phrase, "after a short illness," remember this story. Remember the young man whose illness became a curtain drawn across an empire's fear. Remember the silence that followed, and how well it worked. Because the nightmare he tried to hide was not his scandal, or his sickness, or his weakness. It was the understanding that the crown would always matter more than the person who wore it. He died knowing that his family would mourn him publicly, while privately thanking fate. He died knowing that the story told about him would be one he could never recognize. He died, finally, the way the monarchy required, quietly, usefully, and beyond question. And if you think the lesson ended there, look again. Look at the patterns of secrecy, the rehearsed sorrow, the perfect statements that follow every modern royal death. Look at the way memory is managed, how truth is curated like ceremony. The machinery still runs, the nightmare still breathes. If this story fades again, the silence wins twice. And history will continue to be written by those who understand that omission is the purest form of control. So remember him not as a scandal or as a saint, but as a warning, a reminder that institutions built on illusion will always require someone to vanish. If this voice goes quiet, if this story disappears from your feed tomorrow, you'll know why. The silence has found it again. Stay curious, keep questioning, keep remembering. Because the only rebellion history ever allows is memory itself.